Can you imagine living in a world you cannot see? I mean, could you truly imagine how your experience of the world would be different if you physically perceived it completely differently to how you do now? And if you can, or if you can't, what does it matter? My name is James Douglas, I'm 18, and I have oculocutaneous albinism, which is a condition that affects roughly 1 in 17,000 people worldwide, according to the National Organization for Rare Disorders. Albinism leads to a visual impairment, which means I have quite bad eyesight. Now, before we go any further with the talk, I'd just like to clarify that this talk is based on my personal experience. Every disabled person is obviously a person, so will have a completely different experience and completely different opinions, even if they had the exact same condition as myself. So I've spent a lot of my time trying to imagine, I've spent a lot of my life trying to imagine what the world looks like to someone who's fully sighted, and trying to help fully sighted people imagine what the world looks like to me. So today I'm going to be talking about my journey in understanding these things and the challenges I faced, as well as kind of wrapping up by talking about, is it actually important that we can imagine a world we can't see? So when I heard the theme for today was imagine, I immediately knew I wanted to give this talk, because the most commonly asked question I get as a visually impaired person is people asking me, what can you see? When people ask this, they want me to help them imagine what the world looks like through my eyes. And I'm not surprised I get this so much. You know, people are naturally curious, and above that, they want to try and understand what the world looks like to me, so they can better understand my limits and what I might need help with. But even after 18 years, I still don't think I have a perfect answer to this question. And that's because trying to imagine a world that has a completely different normal to the world you're used to is a difficult thing to do. I think one of the reasons this can be so difficult is because of our concept of what's normal and what isn't. So as someone with a visual impairment, who was born with a visual impairment, my experience of normal throughout my life has been completely different to the experience of normal you'll probably have. So it's completely different to the experience of normal you'll probably have. It can be difficult for me to actually understand how my eyes are different, and it can be difficult for other people to understand that I can't understand maybe where they're coming from. Because to imagine anything, you need to contrast it to your own frame of reference. And I've obviously got a very different frame of reference to most of you. In fact, when I was younger, I really struggled to understand that what I was seeing wasn't normal. I've never been in a fully sighted person's head, so I never understood what to them should have been normal. I could see myself, I could see the people around me, I could see the pictures and books in school, and I couldn't imagine that there was anything more to see, because I had never seen anything more. And I didn't even understand what my family and what my teachers meant when they told me I had bad eyesight. But this changed as I got older, and about age 7 or 8, I started to compare myself to others. I started to realize that if I was walking towards someone, they could recognize me way before I could recognize them, and that the only text-heavy books in school I could read were the ones my classroom assistant had made bigger for me. So now I started to see, actually, yeah, I am different to what most people consider to be normal, although I still didn't fully understand exactly what this meant. But now I realized that, yes, I was at least partially different, and my eyes were different. I tried to do more research into my specific condition, albinism. I asked a lot of optometrists and people from the RNIB to try and help me understand, and that was useful. But probably the thing that helped me the most was talking to people who had full eyesight and asking them, can you see this? Can you see this? And just listening to what they said and comparing it to what I had experienced. And through this, I began to at least partially quantify my own limits. But even as I began to accept that, yeah, I was disabled and I did have these limits, I still couldn't actually imagine what the world looks like to a fully sighted person. And I still can't imagine that. Just last week, I was talking to some friends of mine, one of whom has just learned to drive. And we were talking about the driving test and how one of the parameters of the test is reading a number plate from 20 meters away. Now, I looked out the window and tried to read the number plate of a car that was 10 meters away, and obviously I couldn't do it, while my friends could rhyme it off pretty easily. Now, I've had conversations like this a lot with people in the past, but for whatever reason, this time it struck me just how strange it felt that they were able to read this and I couldn't. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine looking out there and seeing anything but a blur in the end of the number plate. But I just couldn't, because on a basic level, it doesn't make sense to me that everyone else's perception of the world is so different to mine. In the same way, you wouldn't get a Victorian camera and expect to receive an HD photograph from it, because that level of precision is so far above what that camera can achieve. The reason I struggle to imagine what the world looks like through a fully sighted person's eyes is because that goes beyond any experience I've ever had. And it doesn't just stop at reading number plates from a certain distance away. If I had full eyesight, if I had more average eyesight, the world would look entirely different to me, entirely more detailed. And trying to imagine how everything you've ever seen would look if it was more detailed than anything you've ever experienced is a very difficult thing to do. So if I can't imagine what the world looks like to you, can you at least imagine what the world looks like to me? Well, this sounds like, on the surface at least, it should be a lot simpler, because although I've never had experience of perfect vision, you've all probably had experience of imperfect vision, whether that's forgetting your contact lenses one day in work or just looking through condensation on a window. But even still, it's taken me a long time to get a proper answer to the question, what can you see? At first, when people would ask me this, I would just rhyme off what I'd heard at the optometrists. I'd tell people how I had albinism, a condition which meant I had pale hair. I had a lack of pigment, which led to pale hair, pale skin, and also affected my eyes. And this led to nystagmus, which means my eyes shake about instead of being able to focus on anything. And how this meant I had a visual acuity of 636. So what a typical person can see at 36 meters, I can see in the same detail at 6 meters. But listening to that, do you feel you can properly imagine the world through my eyes? Probably not. So as I got older, I tried to look for something better. In my early teens, I took up photography, and although a visually impaired photographer sounds a bit funny, I started to use this experience to help better describe my eyesight. Now, if someone asks me what I can see, I tell people that even with glasses, the world to me looks like you're viewing it through an unfocused camera. I can see the same things as everyone else, but the detail becomes smudged. I can see if there's a crowd of people, but I can't identify who's who. And if I'm looking at a sheet with words on it, I can see that there's text, but actually trying to read the specific text is challenging because it merges into each other. So now at least you maybe have a snapshot to help you imagine at least a snapshot of what the world looks like to me. But can we do better? Well, recent technologies like VR headsets or older technologies like blindfolds or glasses that recreate certain visual impairments seem like they'd be good for this because they do most of the imagining for you. You just have to put it on and you can see what a visually impaired person would see. But I still feel these fall a bit short of helping you to actually imagine how I experience the world. Because in the same way you can't talk about experiencing a film from watching a trailer, you can't put on a headset for 5 minutes and understand what a life with a visual impairment is like. Besides that, these simulations and trying to directly help people imagine a visually impaired world can actually lead to harm. Research in 2017 by Dr. Michelle Nario-Redmond suggests that these simulations, whilst they certainly improve empathy people feel towards disabled people, can cause the people doing the simulations to become distressed and actually increase things like pity and encourage people to underestimate the disabled, which isn't really what we want. We want to try and create communities, not pity. So, and the other problem with trying to imagine just exactly what I can see, to try and understand what the world looks like to me, is that a physical disability is often more than just physical. When you have a visual impairment or another disability, the world's very different. You have very different opportunities, sometimes for better or for worse. People treat you differently. And unfortunately, there's some mental conditions people are more likely to develop. People may be more likely to be anxious for the future, or if they have to go somewhere, it's quite worrying for them because they just don't know what they're walking into and if it will be accessible for them. So even if our most accurate methods to try and imagine what the world looks like to someone who cannot see fall short, does imagination in this context even matter? Well, I think, yeah, it still has its place. As we said, it can help create empathy, it helps start conversations, and simulations and things like it at least give you some understanding of how I can specifically deal with a specific scenario. So to answer the question I asked at the beginning of the talk, can you imagine a world you cannot see? You know, probably not. So then what do we use instead of imagination to try and create a more accessible world? Well, I think communication is more important. Instead of trying to imagine walking a mile in a visually impaired person's shoes, just ask the people who've been wearing those shoes their entire life and try and read and learn from disabled people as to what they need. For example, if you're designing a website, maybe ask a visually impaired person if it's accessible for them. Or instead of asking someone, what can you see, ask them, well, what do you do? How do you experience the world? How do you adapt? What do you do differently to me? Because not just does that question focus on what people can do as opposed to their limitations, it will actually give you a better understanding of how they experience the world than just asking them what their physical perception of it is. Although it is worth noting some disabled people would really rather you didn't talk about the disability to them much at all, because at the end of the day, they've probably got tons of other interests and hobbies. They're not defined by the disability, and there might be other stuff they'd rather talk about. So, while I may not be able to imagine what the world looks like through your eyes, and you might not be able to imagine what the world looks like through mine, by having more proactive and inclusive discussions about disability, we can still make the world more accessible for everyone. Thank you.